Hello everybody, here we are today and we have a video where we never really covered this topic on my thoughts on expansion in the NHL, as the league kind of seems to be leaning towards it will expand in the future. Now before we start, please make sure to subscribe if you're new to me or hockey, whatever the case may be. That being said, let's get on into it. So we're going to go through the pros of this and the cons of this. So starting out with the pros, more teams, which theoretically means more interest in markets maybe you wouldn't be as inclined to see people in. I don't live in Houston, Texas. I don't live in Atlanta, Georgia. However, I could say that maybe we would see more interest in those markets. Big markets in Atlanta was talked about as being a city that's on the up and up in terms of population growth. Houston, I know, is an absolutely massive city. While there might be some people that are fans of the Stars in Houston, you could possibly see more interest in the market of Houston with them having a local team. Same could be said with the city of Atlanta. They used to have two NHL teams. They had the Flames way back in the day, and then of course they had the Thrashers, which isn't that long ago. But since then, who do you root for? Do you root for Tampa Bay? Do you root for the Hurricanes? Do you root for the Predators? Do you root for the Stars? I don't really know how it all works there in terms of NHL fandom. So just right there, having more interest in those markets would be big. Another thing is more money. And this would just be in terms of an expansion fee. The Seattle Kraken paid a little over $650 million, if I'm not mistaken, on their expansion fee. That all gets split up for every team, and they end up getting to pocket it from what I recall. So with this, you'd have to imagine that the expansion fee would be even bigger, as you see a city like Seattle looks to be doing pretty well in the hockey market. So are we talking about 700, 750 million, 800 million? I really couldn't tell you, but I do know this. Owners surely wouldn't mind to have a little bit more cash, and to have, 30, 35, 40 million definitely wouldn't hurt. And it's one of those things where would be good for the league. More money is never really a bad thing. And then of course you have more merch being sold, which kind of ties into more interest in that area. You have people in Atlanta that probably do wear Lightning gear. They probably wear Hurricanes gear. You have people in Houston that probably wear Stars gear. But just having more merch to be able to sell in those areas would be big. And let's not kid ourselves, especially if they have good logos and good colors. We're all going to buy some new stuff for these teams. Seattle, I think, had some of the best selling stuff their inaugural season. They got a great color scheme. Their logo, I think, could be a little better, but I still think it is a good logo. So if these two teams that were new, and I'm just saying Houston and Atlanta for example, we could probably see merchandise sales go through the roof and probably be number one and number two in their inaugural seasons. If we had a team in Quebec City, you know that they'd probably be selling stuff pretty well here. So merchandise would be really big in terms of what it could bring to the table for sales. Even if it was just for the short term, 1 year of sales of multiple new teams would make the NHL very happy because, again, more money. And then with two more positives, you have the potential development or growth and just investment in general in the grassroots of the game. You would have a city like Quebec. I mean, it's probably going to be all right in terms of keeping the game passionate. But let's say, again, a city like Houston, a city like Atlanta, what they could get in terms of developing and growing the game in that area. I don't really know Texas particularly well, but I'm sure that the hockey teams down there are few and far between. I don't really follow high school Texas hockey, I guess if you want to call it that. Georgia, I would probably say it's even less. That's more of college football, baseball, NFL, stuff like that. So getting a foothold in some of these areas and being able to grow the game at the youth level and up would be a great step to see the game kind of grow in each region, which I think would be big. And then finally, against everything I've kind of said so far, maybe we get a Canadian team. I know I said Quebec earlier, but for the most part, I've been focusing on those bigger cities in the US. There's been some moments where it's been teased that we could see another Canadian team. Never really kind of lives up to the moment. Quebec seems to be the odds-on favorite, and then it never really seems to land. I don't know, it would be cool to get the 8th Canadian team. 7 feels like a weird fit, especially how they'll have some teams, 3 Canadian teams play each other at the start of the year. Like they did this year, it would be cool to see every team be able to play another Canadian team, and it would be good for the nation, as again, you have another team in there and more interest within the nation, if that's even possible. And then for the cons, this is going to be something that needs to be talked about as well. The division in the conferences would all be just absolutely wrecked. You have everything set up nice and neat. 32 divides really well. You have two conferences, which divides into 16 teams, and then you have two divisions in each conference, which divides into 8 teams per conference, or division, I should say. And that is really good. If you have 34, you would divide that by 2, you get 17. How do you even break that down? You really don't. Then you'd have 36 if you wanted to go another route there. You divide that by 2, you get 18. Do you have 2 divisions of 9? How would that work in terms of scheduling? Again, I really couldn't tell you. Everything's kind of set out nice and neat right now. There's a reason I think some of these teams and leagues have stopped at 30, 32 teams. And for now, we've obviously stopped at 32 teams. So it just kind of makes sense. But at the same time, again, money. But then it also begs the question, where does it end? Where do we draw the line? Are we in a spot where I'm 70 years old and I'm still making videos and we're in a league that has 50 teams? I don't want to make it seem that dramatic, but again, I'm sure if you said back in the 60s or whatever, hey, we're going to have a league that has 32 teams and it has plans on expansion, they would probably be a little bit shocked by that. Again, probably because of the fact that you'd be looking at it increasing almost 6-fold, but just one of those situations where if we attribute everything to money, when do we stop? And the question is, then why would we stop if it's all about money? Of course, another bad thing is it would be harder for your team to win a cup. This is just obvious. Every time that they add a new team, that is another team that gets in the way of your draft picks, of signing your players, retaining them, or getting guys in free agency, and makes it that much more difficult for you to get to the Stanley Cup final. Some teams obviously have never won a Stanley Cup. You're looking at teams like the Canucks, a team like the Sabres. There are plenty of other teams out there, the Jackets, of course, that have never been able to hoist Lord Stanley. Do we really want to make it that much harder for even teams like the Leafs to be able to win the Cup? I know that seems kind of crazy, but we could be looking at droughts becoming extremely long because there's so much competition that it would just be so difficult to be able to see your team make it. If there was 36 teams, I know that seems only like 4, but it would just be that much more difficult for your team to win. I don't think anybody's really in favor of making it harder for their team to win championships. Another aspect about your team suffering is the expansion draft. Now, will they tweak some things around? I don't really know, because with Vegas, they got a good expansion draft. Seattle kind of went in a way where they saved money a little bit, but it allowed them to make signings in the offseason after their first season. It's one of those deals where you could very well lose some good young players, maybe an experienced veteran that you didn't want to lose, but you had to protect a younger guy. It just is something you don't want to see because, again, losing players you want to keep and just making it harder for your team to win. And probably seeing a guy that maybe you have his jersey, so it would be painful to say, well, I've got this guy's jersey and we literally didn't protect him at all, so he was taken in the expansion draft. It's happened to some teams in recent memory with the Vegas and Seattle expansion drafts. Not hard to imagine that it would happen again with whoever ends up getting an expansion. And then this isn't necessarily a con, but it would be more work for me. I do love making videos, but season previews, sometimes it's so hard to be able to get them out on time. You had 2, 4, 8 new teams, whatever the case may be. Now it is even that much more difficult for me to be able to get things done out in a reasonable time. People have said since the channel was created, hey, I'd really like it if you did season reviews. Now throw in the playoffs and all those things and trying to do season reviews, which I haven't even decided if I'm going to do it yet. And it just gets that much more difficult to do. I would gladly do it, but I'm just more so worried about getting things out on time and in a reasonable fashion. And also, too, you get guys where maybe they shouldn't necessarily be on a roster, but because there's so many teams, they have to pull more players that are depth guys or maybe AHL guys to play in the league, because with more teams, you have to fill the roster spots. So overall, what are my thoughts on this? My thoughts on this is there are some cities where I really would like to see them get teams. Maybe they lost teams, maybe they've never had teams at the NHL level. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I am in favor of not expanding really at all. I look at it as 32 just goes into everything so well. I think 32 teams are plenty. There are other professional leagues that have like 18 to 20 teams in their system. I know soccer typically has 20, and we are already well above that mark. North American sports have done that, but in general, again, if you go to 34, that's not going to make sense. If you go to 36, that's going to make things more difficult. Do you stop at 40? It really just becomes a question of where do you draw the line, and I could see them, as long as there was people willing to pay expansion fees, willing to expand. And at that point, if you're talking about 40 teams or more, winning your conference would almost be like winning a championship because of how hard it would be to do. And to be honest, I think we just really need to focus on the development of the grassroots of the sport. youth on up, making it stronger. The NHL is already probably going to be fine at the top level, but we need to, especially in the US, people to grow the game and get more kids skating and get more kids playing to grow interest in the US, because you've got 350 some million people, a lot of immigration happening to where the population is probably going to grow. Someday that's probably like 400 million, whatever it is, for the population. That's potentially 400 million viewers you could be getting. Now, it's not going to be that high, but just something we have to do, growing it there, keeping interest in Europe, and then trying to attract in other markets. But we don't necessarily need to focus on adding some new teams. As much as it pains me to say this, I would be more in favor of relocation over expansion. I never want to see anybody lose their teams, but I'll say this again, it just doesn't really seem like the right move for me to add more teams in the future. But anyway, what are your thoughts? How do you feel about expansion? Because I feel like people have pretty strong opinions one way or the other. Let me know down below in the comments. Also, please make sure to like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're new. Everybody stay safe. Have a great night. And you go with hockey, all right. Goodbye, Brigadiers and Brigadettes. This is your captain signing off. Have a great night.